So first off, hello again. Happy New Year. I'm Bob Crum, the Executive Director of the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization and the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. And I want to welcome everybody to our regular meeting, January 11, 2022 meeting of our Joint Policy Committee and Working Group. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we continue to navigate through our mask wearing, etc. I'm going to attempt to give this a go. The mayor and I talking through our mask and talking right into the microphone. If at any point it's not audible, please let us know, and we can do whatever we need to do to make everybody be able to hear everything that's occurring while we keep ourselves safe through this process. We are in a public meeting setting. Rob Cofield is taping a meeting for us and live streaming, so this is a public meeting. We'll be doing a roll call here shortly for attendance. But what I'd like to do, just real quickly, just remind everybody, if there's anything you need, drinks, hot coffee on this cold morning, let us know. We'll certainly get staff on that for you. Restrooms are out the back door and to the right, okay? Mayor Price, I'd like to turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman, to call our meeting to order, please.
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. I really want to welcome everyone to this Joint Steering Policy Committee and Working Group meeting for Tuesday, January 11th. And I'm saying we're going to go ahead and do a roll call. We're going to just start going around the room, just give your name and who you represent.
If I may be, I apologize, Mr. Chairman, if I may begin with a roll call of our steering committee and then working group, and then after that, we're going to go around and make certain we capture everyone, because I think we have some folks representing other members. Okay, so I apologize. All right, so just as a reminder, when your light is not on, you lock, you press it. When it turns red, you lock. Sorry about that. It would be great, but it's red. Okay. All right, so let's begin with our policy committee members. From Chesapeake, Mayor West.
I have no phone button, but I'm here.
All right. Keith or Rob, could we get Chris to get the mayor a live microphone? From Hampton, Mayor Todd.
Present.
Thank you, Mayor. From Newport News, Mayor Price.
Present.
From Norfolk, Vice Mayor Thomas.
Present.
Mayor Glover from Portsmouth sends his regrets. Something came up that prevented him from attending, but we are fortunate to have the staff team here today. So thank you, and we'll get that roll call taken care of in a moment.
Sure.
From Suffolk, Mayor Doom.
Here.
From Virginia Beach, I don't see Mayor Dower. Okay, let's go down to the working group now. When I mention the working group name, if you are representing a working group member, if you could please let us know. Let's start with Chesapeake, Troy Eisenberg. Hey, Troy. From Hampton, Jason Mitchell.
Present.
Thanks, Jason. From Newport News, Brian Still. Present. From the city of Norfolk, Amy Inman.
Present.
Thanks, Amy. From Portsmouth, James Wright.
Present.
Thanks, James. And then also,
Carl Jackson.
thank you, Carl. From Suffolk, Jason Sowers.
Present.
Jason. And from Virginia Beach, Rick Loman.
Mark James here for this.
Very good. And Mayor, I apologize. With that, I like your plan of going through. If you haven't introduced yourself, if you could.
Good morning. My name is Camelia Raventag, and I'm the Regional Connector, so the project coordinator for the HRPO.
Good morning, I'm Pavitra Parthasarathi with the HRPO.
Good morning, Kevin Page, HR TAC.
Paul Rideau with the consulting team.
Lorna Harkins, good morning, also with the consulting team.
Lynn Keenan, City of Hampton.
Leslie Dobbins Noble, Army Corps of Engineers.
Keith Lockwood, Army Corps of Engineers.
Al Moore, City of Suffolk.
Yeah, I think we've heard-
Michael King representing Navy Region there.
Very good. And I see Eric coming in the back, Eric Stringfeld from VDOT. Welcome, Eric.
Okay, do we have any, public comments?
We did not receive any public comments in advance, but let's pause a second and see if anybody would like to address our comments. They are seeing none. I'll send it back over to you, sir.
Okay, we, have the minutes before us and we're, out. We'd like to have a motion to approve the minutes. If there are no corrections.
So moved.
Second. Moved in second. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Then the minutes have been approved and accepted. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Mr. Chairman. So for our policy committee members and working group members, you'll recall at our last meeting on October 12th, we had a very productive meeting where you endorsed a revised approach to advancing the regional connector study. At a high level, the approach that was outlined was that all of the alternatives that as identified as the mandatory segments would move forward in the analysis. But the analysis would take a detailed look at each of those segments, each of those options, and do a detailed analysis of the advantages of each option, the potential negative community impacts of various options, how they would address need, how they would benefit our community, how they would achieve the goal and mission of the study in terms of providing connectivity between the south side and the peninsula. And then those options would be tiered into 3 tiers based on project readiness. We had a unanimous vote supporting that option by this group. And our consultant team has been working hard since that point to revise the scope of work and revise the time frame so that we can move the study forward per your direction. So I'm going to turn it over to our Michael Baker team. I think Lauren Carkins is going to take the lead on this. Paul Corvetto providing support as well. And let Lauren walk us through this. At the conclusion then, we're going to be looking for your questions and comments. And we would like to have action by you today in endorsing this revised scope of work and schedule forward. So Lorna, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. So thank you so much for that summary and introduction, Bob. That really sets the stage for what we want to talk with you about today. Our goal is to walk you through items 5 and 6 on the agenda that you see here. First, we're going to give you an overview of the process that we're proposing, in order to conduct this sort of pivot that we're making towards a tiering of the mandatory segments. So the first part of the presentation will focus on the process for moving through draft and final tiering and completing the project. The second part of the presentation, number 6, will actually go into some detail on the criteria that we have in mind, the evaluation measures that we would use in that first step of the evaluation process, so that we can leave today's meeting with an understanding of that and with an eye towards really starting to move forward with this new scope of work. So, as I said, we'll start with the proposed approach to supporting project completion. So the mandatory segments really have not changed in the sense that we are looking at the same segments that have come out of the SEIS. And the updated methodology that's approved by the steering committee in October asks us to evaluate and sort the segments into chronological tiers based on readiness and the known challenges associated with construction and permitting. And as Bob touched on, that tiering looks a lot like this, what you see in this slide. so instead of moving towards selecting one alternative, we're keeping all of the segments on the table and we're tiering them, we're sorting them into these 3 tiers. The first tier, tier 1, is favorable for constructability and permitting and favorable for readiness. The second tier is still favorable for readiness, perhaps not as strongly, and then it's favorable or perhaps has more of a mixed profile of constructability and permitting. And tier 3 is where we see current challenges for constructability and permitting and a higher degree of uncertainty that requires additional information. And I think one of the things that we've concluded as we've moved in this direction is that there are things that we see as impediments to moving forward with a project or even identifying a reasonable alternative at this time that could be resolved in the future. And that's why we want to take timing considerations into account in how we evaluate the segments and keep that tier 3 level in the tiering scheme to acknowledge that that there is there's a time and a place in the future perhaps for any of these segments. So to move through this process of sorting the segments into tiers, we've broken we have a scope of work that's very detailed, but the process really has 4 steps. The first step is a qualitative assessment of its construction complexity and cost drivers, permitting issues, and readiness along with those timing issues. So that first step starts with the segments as all of the segments as they've been previously defined, and we look at, what do we know about what the ability for the segment to move forward, and the issues that will drive its cost and its challenges in both engineering and permitting. So we'll produce a draft, so that's a qualitative assessment, and we're going to produce a draft tiering as a result of those considerations. Then we move to step 2, where we will move into a more quantitative study of congestion reduction. And this is where we will look at those issues that we identified in step 1 about constructability and permitting and mitigation and say, can we solve some of these things? So we'll refine the segment alternatives at that time, and that's when we'll develop cost estimates. And we will revisit the tiering to see if we've resolved any issues such that something would change in its tiering recommendation. So after step 2, which is the quantitative assessment, we finalize the tiering of the segments, and then we move into the completion of the project. The step 3 is conducting the scenario analysis. We've done a lot of work to be able to then take the segments that we have and kind of test them out relative to some different assumptions about the future that consider more freight, consider different levels of freight movement on truck versus rail, et cetera. So we're stress testing those segments, the tier 1 and tier 2 segments at that point. And we'll also do traffic operational analysis that will allow us to further refine the segment cost estimates. And then the final step is just documenting everything. And across the bottom, you see there's several steps in the completion of our public engagement process that will move along concurrent with that. So I want to pause before moving forward and note that while we've been studying the regional connectors, a lot of projects have been moving forward. A lot of things have been accomplished. This is the recent map of the program of investments from HR TAC, their regional transportation priority projects. And you can see that even within the mandatory segments, there are some advancements. And so we want to take a moment while we're rescoping the project to move forward and consider what it means that some of the projects in the region have moved forward while we've been involved in this study. And what it boils down to for us is that when we get to step 2, we do have to consider if any of the HR TAC 2045 program of finance projects that overlap with the mandatory segments might be far enough along in our timing evaluation that we would put them over into our baseline network. And that just means that we're going ahead and acknowledging that this is a project that we fully expect to move forward. So that's another change that you see in our scope of work. So we'll have the RCS 2045 baseline network that's unique to our study that takes into account projects that, that have really moved along while we've been doing this study. So just to kind of walk you through that and how we'll approach that, as I mentioned, step one, we'll do that qualitative assessment of the segments, looking at the existing, and then in the case of where the express lanes have updated information about the segments, we will take that into account for construction complexity, permitting issues, and project readiness. In a moment, I'll talk you through that in more detail. But I do want to note that the permitting issues do include kind of social environmental factors as well. And with that information, when we move to step two, we will take a look at so there are two of our mandatory segments that are also in the HR TAC 2045 Plan of Finance. And when we look at that information about project readiness in particular, we will consider if those two overlapping segments are differentiated from each other such that we would consider putting a project that's much further along in readiness into the baseline network. It's evident that the I-664 southern segment from Bowersville Interchange to College Drive is moving along under study with PDOT. And so that's the one segment that we particularly want to consider. When we get to the end of our study, we don't want to be presenting an action and a cost estimate that overlaps with a project that is also advanced in funding under the HR TAC program of finance. So that's just it's a technical aspect, but it's not unimportant. And that's why we wanted to bring it to your attention, that we would anticipate based on that tier one or that first step one evaluation, that we would come to you at the beginning of step two and make that decision about changing the status of the segment that should move over to the baseline network. So with that process in mind, we've laid out a schedule that gets us through the remainder of the study. This is kind of the most aggressive schedule that we can lay out to complete the study in the time frame that we had originally, or that we had agreed to before we made this change in scope and direction, which means finishing up in June of 2023. So we think we can still achieve that if we're able to move forward with the decisions as laid out in this schedule. So step one takes about 4 months. We get a green light today. We'll dive into that first step of qualitative evaluation. And we'll be setting the stage for the quantitative evaluation follows. We'll be able to complete that in another 3 months or so. And then the next step, which is the scenario analysis and also the traffic operational analysis and finalizing the cost estimates and technical details of the segments. That takes a little bit longer. That's about a 7-month process, and then 4 months to just finish up our documentation. So that's how we see the schedule laying out. So that completes an overview of kind of the revised scope of work that you have in front of you. We'll talk more in detail about the actual evaluation measures in a moment, but I certainly want to pause for any questions about the process and the revised scope that we've provided.
Okay, are there any questions?
Mr. Chair, I would just like to say I appreciate the scope of work and the schedule that Lorna has put forth and she's brought to the committee. Just concerned about looking at this baseline network And I would agree that 664 is certainly ready, but I think that we need to really sit down and reconsider 164 at this point. No work or no studies have been done on that. There'd be significant environmental justice impacts. So I'm not ready to move forward with 164 as part of the baseline, at least not at this point.
And if you'd like me to clarify, I agree with you, and that's why we think using the information that we generate in step one, in that evaluation, that will include not only environmental but social considerations of anticipated impacts of each segment. We do anticipate that even though both of these segments are in the HR TAC plan of finance, we think it's likely, when you consider the advancement of the 664 project, that is the project that is most likely to warrant putting into the baseline network. So we have to go through that process. We will provide the information to support that decision, but I think it's fairly evident, given the advanced state of study of this segment of I-664, that you're likely predicting the very outcome of the process.
Oh, good, that's good to know. So we're voting on the process right now, not the baseline network.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you all will, the steering committee will make a decision affirming the baseline network at the end of step one.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
may I ask a question? I'm not sure if it's appropriate time now, but we go back to, I think, our late spring, maybe early summer meetings. There were two. One which 164 was not included. The second was when 164 was included. And part of the decision process at that time was there was an earmark, I think, before Congress. I'm not sure if it was by Congressman Gloria or someone else. And so the concern was, why move before this process of the earmark request had proceeded? So I'd like to know, if it's appropriate now to ask, has that process proceeded? And if so, what was the outcome? Because I think it was stated at that time that if the earmark was made, then the money would be there, I think, to do the study or the inclusion of 164. So I just want to know if that's appropriate now, if there's an answer for it, or for me to wait till a later time.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, thank you for that question, Mayor Todd. I'm not aware that any of the earmarks have come to pass. There were a number of earmark submissions from our region that occurred this past spring. The port had talked about possibly, mentioned at this meeting, an earmark request for study of 164. But I am not aware that that money has been secured. Kevin, you've been at those tables with me. Are you aware that they have any of those funds have come?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Tuck and Executive Director Crum. I'm unaware of any forthcoming federal funding awards at this time. I know that the request was submitted by the Port Authority. I think the Maritime Association has supported that, but I have not heard that there's been put on the bond yet due to those efforts.
And Mayor, if I may, sir, as well, I want to thank Portsmouth for your comments on the 164, so that we have everything on the table as we consider this process moving forward. Just to stress, today, Carl, thank you for the way you phrased that, we're voting on the process today. We'll get to the point of what goes into that baseline network. But even if a segment isn't in a baseline network, we will still screen it, we will evaluate it, we will review it, right? So what this doesn't, we got to make some assumptions in that baseline network, and I understand, I think Portsmouth's raising important issues that there's questions to answer or ask and answer there first. And Carl, you mentioned environmental justice and other things. We'll be doing that through this process, whether it ends up in the baseline network or not. But it will be this group's decision if that occurs. So just to stress, because those are really important issues that we need to be certain that we fully understand. I know Portsmouth's very aware of this.
And if I could just add one item to that, this number of bundles that we look at in step 2, that's where we string the segments together into bundles so that we can create a network that we're testing in our travel demand model and do the more quantitative analysis and look at congestion relief in particular. And we designed that number of bundles to be able to do some with and without options among the segments so that we can continue to bring insight into all of the segments as we move forward.
Any further questions? Yes.
I guess I'm not sure it makes any difference or that I'm really understanding. It seems like the purpose is, first of all, congestion reduction. So why wouldn't that be the first step, determine which does the most reduction of traffic, and then determine these other issues? And I'm not sure that it would make any difference, but it just seems strange to me that one before the other.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and it comes down to kind of the process of the engineering activities that we have on this project. So in that qualitative view, we've really kind of been chomping at the bit to take a look at those issues around permitting, right? And one of the things that happens when you do that is you find out what are the things that will drive up the cost of the project so that we can avoid these permitting issues. So we need to understand that before we get to that more refined engineering assessment, and we kind of better understand how we would be connecting the segments to each other, because in the congestion relief analysis, we have to look at networks. We can't just look at individual segments. We have to look at, how they would combine in the real world. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Mayor, we would like to ask that both the steering committee and the working group consider actions to improve the revised scope and schedule as I can have our consultant.
I'll make the recommendation to approve. Oh, sorry. I'm actually not a voting member.
I move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved in second. We're ready to vote on this. All those in favor of the schedule process as proposed by the consultants, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
If I may stress, so this would be a vote of both the policy committee, but also our working group members as well, because we want to make certain that our staff teams are comfortable as well. So if I could just ask for clarification that there's no objections.
Thank you. None of those.
Very good. Well, Mayor, we will continue to go to Lorna as she discusses with us the evaluation criteria for the draft hearing.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we've been using a certain set of terminology to describe these evaluation criteria, and I want to go a little bit deeper now so you can see, the true type of issues, the level of information that we want to consider in that first step where we are going to do the draft tiering of segments. So we're going to use existing data to evaluate the mandatory segments, and we're going to base that on some identifiable issues that fall into 3 categories. So the first one, which we've been saying constructability for short, but what we mean is complexity of construction and key cost considerations. The second one, which we've been saying as permittability, is issues with permitting and key environmental impacts. So it's a little bit more complex than strictly permitting. And then the last one is project readiness factors. So I'm going to walk you through each one of these and give you a sense of how we will do this qualitative evaluation. And again, this is for each of the mandatory segments. So starting with construction complexity, and you have this in your handout, so you can, if you're not finding the slide legible, you can see it in front of you and move back and forth between the pages as needed. So construction complexibility, and this is slide 16, if you want to, if that helps you find it. All right, so construction complexity starts with design and construction issues. The first one is really the overall design complexity. Are there structures? Are there tunnels? So that those are things that are going to make it more complicated and of course more costly as well. Secondly is constraints of local, state, or federal activities. So are there things happening in this same corridor that are going to add to the complexity? For example, we're aware of the water pipeline that's being planned adjacent to I-664. And we've talked about a lot of those same issues in this committee as well, even gone to do some field views of some of those adjacent activities that add to the complexity. The next criteria is design dependency with other mandated segments. And what this means is we might be able to build one segment, let's say at a certain height across the harbor, but if it has to connect with all the other segments, then it might actually have to be higher up. So are there inter-segment complexities that would also add to the complexity of a given segment? And then the next consideration is, will there be significant disruptions to traffic in order to construct this particular segment in the first place? The next group of criteria are cost considerations. So right-of-way acquisition is a consideration that can really drive up cost and complexity, because sometimes you have to go to a more complex design to narrow the right-of-way that's required. And then secondly, mitigation of environmental factors, and that can include sound walls or the kinds of mitigation that's necessary to the whole array of permits. So that one is really interrelated with the next set of criteria. We'll evaluate the qualitative aspect of mitigation in the next set of criteria, but we'll take that into account as a cost consideration separately in this set of criteria. And the way that we'll do that process is that each of them will have an impact rating. And we've indicated, high, medium, low here, and we might go to 4 levels at the most, but that would be enough to help differentiate between the segments in the rating that we have. But then we'll also provide notes on what we're calling timing considerations. And those timing considerations do also include issues around feasibility. So when I was talking about the scope of work, I mentioned that in this stage, we're identifying issues that in the next step, when we refine the engineering, we're going to see if we can resolve some of those issues. So those notes that we make about the timing considerations and the complexity of each segment are going to help advise, how we move forward with it. They'll also help advise that readiness evaluation, because some of those timing considerations do speak directly to how soon a project might be able to advance. So we'll have the rating for each criteria, and then we'll also have those important notes on timing considerations. Similarly, with permitting issues, there's a couple different categories. The first category is really focused on the natural environment and the permits. So we're looking at all the different federal permits, state permits, and the local permits. And these address a lot of the issues and constraints around water quality, disturbance of the harbor, and navigability as well. And then the social environment criteria will look at community impacts, including the right-of-way and consistency with local plans. It'll look at sensitivity of the property impacts. Are those impacts to more sensitive facilities, such as those that would require noise abatement or community facilities, cultural facilities? And then thirdly, specifically hone in on environmental justice as a particular type of impact that has special implications and consideration for how a project would advance and whether it would advance. So those are the social environment criteria. And then similar to the first set of criteria, we'll do a qualitative rating for each permit as well as each of the social environment considerations. And we'll also provide those notes on timing considerations, feasibility considerations. And we have a couple of extra categories that kick in for that part of the evaluation, including the mitigation complexity and cost, which, as I mentioned, will actually be rated over in the construction complexity matrix. And then also permitting stakeholder coordination, which is kind of a timing factor. Is there a great deal of complexity in order to coordinate the permits in question? So, so those are the permitting issues and environmental issues that make up this part of the evaluation process. And then the last one is readiness, and this has three subcomponents. So the first part is project independence. And this is really getting at, is a given segment kind of ready to go on its own? Or does it rely on other things being completed first in order for it to work? And we have some insights from that, even from the traffic analysis we've already done on the whole network, as well as other information that we can glean. Then the next category is project development. Here we'll be looking at whether it's included in local comprehensive and transportation plans. Is it adopted by a regional agency? Is there engagement with stakeholders or review agencies that suggests, the project is moving along? And then is there advancement of a project study? That's a really critical one. As we noted, for that decision, we have to make about what really belongs in the baseline network as we move into step 2. And then the last section is really just checking in on whether there are some certain opportunities or advantages or screening criteria associated with any segment that change its profile for funding eligibility, including HR TAC funding, smart scale funding, and any of the kind of the new programs in the recently passed infrastructure bill. So those are the readiness criteria, and these would all be just evaluated qualitatively as well. So that's an overview of the criteria. And I know that was pretty quick, so I definitely welcome any questions or further explanation that you can provide.
Yes, do we have any questions? I have one, which may not be would a category of politics involve be involved in this?
That's so great, Mayor. I would like to, I welcome that question and note that there are a couple of criteria in here that speak to the consequences of politics, if you will, such as the permitting stakeholder coordination, which is the bottom of the permitting issue. Some of the consequences of politics could come to bear in that category. And we may find in the readiness factors as well, we're trying to account for the local perspective as well as the regional perspective and how we look at this. And it's our goal that, the sort of the consequences of politics could be objectively considered.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Lorna, I just am wondering about the measures and how we're really going to be able to evaluate these properly. So just, for the constructability, you're looking at right-of-way impacts, but there's no level of design. So there's really, there's no level of design to know what kind of infrastructure really might be needed for any of these segments, right? Other than the 664 that we all, I think, should acknowledge is moving forward at some level. So, but the other segments, I mean, these are projects that will happen many, many years from now. Technology is going to change. I mean, we wouldn't be constructing the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel if we had evaluated the segments based on these criteria. Okay, so looking at traffic impacts, how can you really say what kind of traffic impacts you're going to have for construction today? When you don't, there's no idea. Okay, so I'm concerned about the level of detail that we actually have to make good evaluation based on these measures of these segments. Likewise, for the permitting, I don't think anybody's really going to give you any true feedback until we have an actual project. The Corps, I don't think, would even take a stance on anything until you give them a 60% design. So while we know high level that, okay, there may be some issues here, issues there, but again, we don't know for sure that that a permitting issue is really data, right? So we're going to be making a lot of assumptions based on these measures. So, project readiness, I'm a little more comfortable with since we've talked and I see how you're going to do that. Congestion, of course, I think that's one that we have to think about. That's what HR TAC screens their projects on. So I just wonder, can we take time and really consider the measures that we're going to be using? Or is this a decision that has to be made right now?
So I'd like to take a moment to answer some of the questions that were part of that discussion, Amy. And then I think we'll circle back to that final question, as soon as I get through some of those initial comments. So I think you've really, in a lot of ways, given a good summary of the rationale for moving away from picking an alternative, a preferred alternative, and doing the tiering. Because as you said earlier in your comment, there are things that are unknown, right? There are things that are unknowable even at this moment in time with respect to technology, with things that can be resolved. So that's why what we're going to do is we're going to start at a level of so we're going to have we'll have design criteria, and we're using the SEIS alignments for each segment, so that we do have some level of engineering and we've already prepared that information. So we have some level of engineering that we are basing that initial impact assessment, constructability assessment on, and we do a draft tiering at that point. Then we look as we move forward with more detail of design to see, can we resolve some of those issues? And one of the reasons that we want to keep some tier 3 in the mix is that I think we'll find that there are some issues that are kind of unknowable. And so if we can't resolve those issues, for example, the landfill comes to mind as an example. There are things we can't do until that landfill is closed. So that can be resolved out at a future point in time, and we shouldn't necessarily try to come up with a design that works around that now. So that's a good case for putting something in tier 3. And having those points of reference that relate to the constructability and the timing of a segment that's in a situation like that can be identified in that qualitative assessment and help inform the tiering in that way. So, but then we will advance the design particularly of the tier 1 and 2 segments, so that in step 3, we can actually do traffic operational analysis and have a look at the complexity of traffic issues and make sure that there aren't traffic operational issues that again affect the design that we're proposing to move forward with the tier 1 and tier 2 segments. So that answers some of the technical parts of your question, but I think we can also address the procedural one.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I'm Paul Friedel, I'm also with the Southwest Board on this, and I thought it would be important to say that this is a proposal, and indeed it is qualitative. But our burden is to do that work and bring it to this committee as a draft, and to practically convince the committee that the assessment we've done, even if it's qualitative, strikes the right response to these subjects. And so we could debate, it's very rare, we could debate those results when they're in draft form, and none of it will be final until this group feels that it's correctly done. So I think that's important, that it's a collaborative effort. But we have to do the work first and bring it to this group. And if you say you don't like the way a certain measure looks or the way we scored it, that's exactly for the purpose of this group.
I guess I have one further comment not to add to the complexity of the study, but will there be any if and thens though? If something happens at depot, fueling station, or removal, then this could happen. Is there kind of that type of scenario also included?
I I can see that as a very likely possibility. So this, now that I think it's a great position to not be eliminating improvements of ideas, but just steering them and educating the reader about them. So that could be a case where maybe toward the end of the work, we have scenario A and scenario B for a given location. And that may be where it is until the year 2030 when more information is available.
Any other questions? Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of these criteria are more subjective than others. Are you going to be weighing the more subjective ones differently than the less subjective ones?
So that's a great point. One of the things we're going to try to do in that process of, before we bring it to you, is to be very transparent in how we did the evaluation, and also try to eliminate any kind of redundancy that we can that sort of inherently weights some measures more than others. And then it will be for you to determine if there should be some things weighted more or less than others. So that, when we bring a draft tiering with those scores, as Paul said, that will be, for you to consider and make any final adjustments before we move forward.
Could you talk quickly about the differentiation between permitting issues and then review agency engagement under readiness? Just want to make sure, just curious about the differentiation between those two. Just make sure there's no double counting that might be more punitive against an alternative that might have more environmental challenges, just what the differentiation between those two items are.
Okay, and tell me the second one you're asking about?
Review agency engagement, knowing those will probably be the review agencies that are tied to your permitting issues.
Right, so is that you're talking about the bottom one on this table here?
Just permitting issues is that entire slide, and then the next slide, readiness, you're talking about
Yes,
the
thank you.
review agency engagement as a metric, which is, the review agencies that you're going to be engaging with are that entire previous slide.
Okay, got it, yeah. So, right, so are we creating the outcome on this set of criteria by doing the engagement in the other? Yeah, that's a great question, thank you, I hadn't even thought of that. So in the permittability, we're really going to be focusing on the natural resource and physical environment issues to identify the ones that would complicate the project or make it difficult to permit or to build. In this one, this is more about have those stakeholders, been at the table? Have they been involved? Have they voiced a preference or a concern? So it's a little bit, one is, a little bit more related to the location of the project and the information about it and how it would be built. The other is a little bit more, is there a stated position that lets us know how ready the project may be? Is that clear enough? Sure.
any further questions or comments?
Mayor, if I
Yes.
could just add a quick comment, I think, I really appreciate the guidance of the steering committee and Paul's community working group on this. I think the value of this non-eliminating options allows us to fully vet. And Nora, to your point, I think, Danae, you bring up, you're right? We're not gonna be able to determine if something can get permitted. But we almost queue up further consideration at the appropriate time of the questions that need to be addressed when certain segments get to that stage of the process, right? And it feels like organizing that thought and understanding what those issues are, I think is gonna be a really important outcome. Our hope is that there's gonna be a top tier we can move on. There's gonna be other ones that are gonna require further investigation. It will be part of future work, but I think the value of not having the pressure to throw out any option right now really is gonna pay dividends for us. But the other thing is, I know there's a lot of thought and conversation about, boy, can we really come to a consensus on this? And, not to sound too corny, but I guess it's the regional guy in me, Amy, you made a point I'd like to follow up on. 15 years ago, heck, 10 years ago, who would have ever thought we'd be building through HR TAP, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, 3 segments of the I-64 plans, the 264-64 interchange, and the high-rise bridge in 64 Southside. Camille, did you think that in your career here? But you all did it, right? You did it because we stayed at this table, TPO and HR TAP, and we made some pretty, to quote Kevin, courageous decisions, right? So I think if we can just stay at it, I'm confident we can get there, and I think you have this on a good track now. Like, you know, we're not going to be eliminating options, but we're going to educate ourselves about all the options. I think really puts us on a good path. But Mayor, I'm very confident we'll get there. I'm not saying it's always going to be an easy road, but I no pun intended, but I think we can get there. But Mayor, we would like to, with the great input today, ask if there would be consideration of endorsing this. Again, you're going to see, Paul, thank you, you know, what's coming back to you is going to be in draft form, right? And you're allowed to send us back to the drawing board a couple of times, and we fully expect that. But this will allow us to start organizing this evaluation.
Yes, sir.
A quick question. I saw in the backup materials, a lot of information about public input. And it looks like it's listed by task, and maybe that's just a previous version. Now there are steps. I was just a little bit confused about which input occurred at which point. And the main reason I ask is as far as when we do some public input, it may be a little more challenging to get Virginia Beach involved because we're not directly impacted by the actual alignments, but there's a big benefit for our mobility. So at some point, we would probably like to combine, advertising on our webpage and such. And I see that, with these 4 steps here, they can talk about different levels of engagement. So I wasn't sure exactly if this public input that was in the package is still synced up with the schedule here.
Yes. Oh, great question. Yeah. So we wrote our scope of work starting at the beginning of phase 1, and that determined our task structure. And that does get a little bit confusing. And that's one of the reasons we kind of presented it almost 2 different ways with the steps of our process, but then acknowledging that the scope has these different tasks. So task 1 has been the public engagement task from the beginning. And as you can see in our process diagram, we have an important component of task 1 in each of the upcoming steps in our process. So, after today's actions, we're going to get very busy updating the website to reflect this new direction. And also, we've taken a fresh pair of eyes to it, and we're thinking about some simplifications there too. And then in step 2, and we'll actually start preparing for this very quickly. The plan is to have public meetings, and you'll see in the scope of work, it describes how many, and it's intended for them to be in person, but of course, not knowing the circumstances of COVID at the time, if we have to pivot to a more virtual type of engagement, this group will make that decision. But so those public meetings that you see in the scope of work happen in two waves, if you will. The first wave is during step 2, so the public can comment on that tiering before it's final. And then the public meetings happen again at the end when all the final recommendations and insights are in place. And then while we're doing step 3, we'll also have a regional connectivity symposium, which is also spelled out specifically. And then all of the social media tasks and website and online engagement that goes along with this process that you see in task 1 is still part of our scope of work and will be done. So we definitely welcome those partnerships with, social media announcements and getting people to be engaged. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Okay, if there are no further comments or questions, I'm going to ask for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the draft evaluation measures that were presented today.
Second.
Moving second. Both bodies vote.
Yes, both bodies vote.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, just a few remaining items. We have item number 7 for your information, a diary of key decision points from the beginning of this process to present. We continue to keep that up to date. Our next meeting, our Honestly, no, we have work to do. Lorda and Paul, I think we're looking at probably no need for meeting till April, so we can get a couple of months' work done. So you'll be hearing from us to schedule something probably the mid or latter part of April would be the next meeting for this meeting. Mr. Chairman, unless there's other items that the group would like to address, that is all we have for you.
I've got one question. Oh, just real quickly, I know in the past we've done a good job of keeping our website up to date, and if we could make sure to have all the presentations and minutes on the website, that'd be good.
Thanks, Carl.
Hit the no other comments, then, motion to adjourn is in order.
So moved.
Yes, we will adjourn, thank you.